Think Again TV is produced by Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I mean, at first, I must confess that I didn't know what I was walking into, because I often am confronted by audiences who are not exactly supportive of what I believe. But the sense I got tonight is that you guys are open to discussion, science, rationality, and I don't get a lot of that when I debate food usually. And that will include some of my colleagues. Okay, now it's on tape. So, the book is titled The Locavore's Dilemma. I was discussing the story before on how I came to write it, and perhaps I should mention it again. So, I'm a professor of geography, and in case you're wondering, no, I'm not looking for new continents, and yes, we do make the best cab drivers once we get our PhDs, but I did manage to get a job at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And I'm what is called an economic geographer by training. So what I do for a living is to look at where business locates where they do, how things change over time, transportation, supply chain, these kinds of things. I also happen to have been born and raised in a small town where my parents had a sugar bush, a sugar shack, so we produced maple syrup, we had a little apple orchard. We tried to keep backyard chickens before it was cool, but we had a little terrier dog who liked them better than we did, so they were gone after 3 days. So after that, we had rabbits instead, but my brother and I would not eat them. So what happened is that at the end of the summer, we would typically trade them for the neighbor's rabbits. So we would eat their rabbits, they would eat our rabbits. And so I kind of experienced the Locavore lifestyle, because my mother was also a big gardener. And I did not really enjoy it. I was very jealous of suburban kids who, would have nice summer jobs, would not have to work for the agricultural producer across the street. So I don't think I ever romanticized food production. But the problem today, I think, obviously, is that our food is produced by less than 2% of us, I mean, in any advanced economy anyway. And a lot of people have become obviously removed from food production and have been exposed and have in many cases absorbed a number of values which I think are kind of threatening to our food system. And so a few years ago, my department invited a prominent Canadian academic who explained why consuming food beyond your local food shed is not something you should do. And he came up with his data and he said, look at my data, the most parasitical people in the world are the Japanese. My wife was born and raised in Tokyo. So she's sitting next to me, there are like 300 people. This is a big event at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. So in order to keep her quiet that evening and save my marriage, I had to promise her to demonstrate that actually, no, Japanese are not parasites. Don't have enough land to grow their food, so they specialize in other things. And then they import food from people who have a lot of agricultural land in places like, New Zealand, Brazil, the United States, what have you. So little did I know that my little policy pieces would become by far the most successful thing I ever wrote. And so one day I'm debating someone on Radio Noon, not too far from here at the CBC building, and somebody calls in and is very angry at me. And it's the person at the University of Toronto who's been charged with promoting local food. So I kind of handled my own. A literary agent turned me, and lo and behold, she was about to go to New York. She asked me to submit a proposal. I did, and the proposal was picked by a rather distinguished publishing house, and the book came to me. So that's my little background story. But that's enough about me. So what I want to discuss tonight is really this whole movement. Well, I would call it a fad, but it's more than that now, which really views community, local things as inherently superior to our current system without asking why so many people work so long and so hard to develop our globalized food supply chain. And so what I want to do at first is cover the history of not only the recent movement, but of several past local food movements that have been around probably as long as long-distance trade and food commodities was created. And then I will examine their rhetoric in more detail. So the idea that local food promotes social capital, jobs and economic development, that it is inherently more sustainable environmentally, that it gives us increased food security, and that it delivers, again, greater taste, nutrition, and safety. So, again, if you're not familiar with this local food movement, and in a place like Toronto, I don't know, you could not have heard of it. There's a little lexicon here. Herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat meat, and locavores eat local. But obviously this movement, as you probably know, has become about something more than food. So this is something I found online. I mean, I don't have the skills to produce that. I have a student here who can attest to my poor computer skills. So you can buy happiness, but you can buy local, and it's kind of the same thing. I'm not quite sure what they mean, but it gives you an idea of what's behind that movement. But then there's something else that perhaps reflects some of the audiences that I've had to deal with in the past. So in our society, growing food yourself has become the most radical of acts. It is truly the only effective protest, one that can and will overturn the corporate powers that be. By the process of directly working in harmony with nature, we do the one thing most essential to change the world: we change ourselves. So I was born in Quebec in the late 1960s, at the time where the FLQ was blowing up mailboxes in Westmount. So if this is the most radical thing that young people will do, I can sort of live with that. But you get a sense, of how almost religious this movement has become. And so you might say, okay, well, it's only a few people. Who cares? Why does it matter? If some people want to do that, it should be their business. Why not? But the problem, of course, is that this rhetoric has become so influential that a lot of large players have bought into it. I mean, they might not necessarily believe it, but they do promote these ideas. And when Walmart essentially co-opts the movement, that local food activists have really achieved something. So in the United States, Walmart has created what are called heritage agricultural projects in the upper Midwest, the Delta states, the I-95 corridor on the West Coast. And they're obviously trying to answer some consumer demand. And why are consumers demanding that? Well, because they've been convinced of a number of alleged benefits for local food. So again, this is something I took online. This is actually from a newspaper in Guelph, so close enough to Toronto. So locally grown food tastes better, local produce is better for you, local food preserves genetic diversity, local food is safe, and they've put this in bold. Local food supports local family, local food builds community, local food preserves open space, local food keeps your taxes in check. Local food supports a clean environment and benefits wildlife, and local food is about the future. The future. But then you've got to wonder, well, okay, this is the future. It's backward than you forward, because, you don't need to go all that far back in the way people used to produce and consume food to think that, well, only a century and a half ago, most of the food that people were eating was actually local. And so is this what our future looks like? First question I typically ask local food activists, well, if things were so great, why did so many people work so long and so hard to create the globalized food supply chain? I mean, most people are, if not inherently lazy, but they won't spend their days building something that is completely unnecessary. And so, I mean, if you want to be logical, if you want to buy food that is local, where do you stop? I mean, is it 161 kilometers? That's the 100-mile diet, in case you don't get my drift here. Or else, why not 50 kilometers? Why not your neighbors? Why not your backyard? And historically, of course, most of our ancestors used to produce most of their food themselves. So some hardworking peasants from sub-Saharan Africa, and the Irish Locavore diet, to which I'll get back later. So when they were growing potatoes and not much else. So the point is that, though, for most of history, before the railroad and the steamship came along, most city provisioning, if perhaps not for some cereal grains, but even if you look at a city like Paris in the 18th century, most of the food consumed in the city came within a 50-kilometer radius. Of course, cities were much smaller than they are today, and people were not very well nourished, but 150 kilometers, as the 100-mile is being promoted at the moment, is actually quite a large radius by historical standard. And so the idea of having backyard chickens or backyard pigs or goats, well, this is what you see in a lot of less developed economies today. But of course, this is London not too long ago. I mean, these animals were ubiquitous. Before refrigeration came along, you wanted fresh meat, well, it needed to be produced very close to your house. You can imagine the smell, so living across the street from a pigsty, but this is what people have to do if they wanted fresh meat. So another thing that didn't travel well was obviously milk and dairy products. So these are the milk cowsheds of London in 1798, all the yellow signs here. So you've got the city of London, but obviously you could bring in animal feed, but you could not make milk travel over long distances. So most of all the milk that was consumed in London was produced locally. But the problem was that only very wealthy people could afford things like fruits and vegetables year-round, because you needed to build greenhouses to do that. So I don't know if any of you have ever been to Dunmore, Scotland, but this is obviously a building in the shape of a pineapple. Why is that? Well, because Europeans discovered pineapple when Columbus reached the Caribbeans, but you could not obviously bring pineapples from the Caribbeans to Northern Europe, to a place like Scotland. So the Earl of Dunmore, discovered though that he liked pineapple. So he had these huge greenhouses built, and he had people working 24 hours a day to keep the temperature acceptable and create the kind of conditions that were suitable for pineapple growing. And so he could afford to eat pineapples, but most people could not, because producing a pineapple back then in the 1700s cost him about $3,000 in terms of current currency. So you could actually buy a stagecoach for that, for the price of a pineapple in those days. So only wealthy people in Europe could afford to eat fresh food, fruits and vegetables year-round, because obviously greenhouse technologies were not all that great, and eating everything with a little coal stove required some skills. So fast forward another century, with the rise of the middle classes in Europe, you see the emergence of market gardens that cater to a broader audience. So this is a picture taken in the late 19th century in Paris. I would like to draw your attention to a few things. So you will see that there are no leaves in the tree here. This is in the winter. You see a wall, which were typically surrounding all market gardens in Paris. That's in order to create a microclimate, get a few additional degrees windbreak. You see those cloches here. Today we would have little plastic tents to, again, protect whatever is growing in horse manure from the elements. And on top of that, they're putting dark straw mats to, again, try to create a few additional degrees. So a lot of people today forget or never knew that as late as the 1880s, roughly about 1/6 of the greater Paris area was devoted to food production, and they came up with about 100,000 tons of produce a year, including pineapples. They were a bit more affordable back then. I haven't been able to find the figure, but they would produce all sorts of things. But you go back to what these people were writing about their business, and it's one of the few times in my career as a researcher that speaking French was actually an asset. You see that they say, well, people used to produce food in cities forever, but in the 1820s, our parents or our grandparents were able to produce green asparagus year-round. And this is when our profession became respectable, because consumers in Paris could appreciate the fact that you could grow green asparagus in the middle of winter in Paris. And then they added all sorts of things, including in the late 19th century, things like pineapples. So these are things that I found in old journals and magazines. So again, cloche. This is before the cars come along, so there's a surplus of horse manure in Paris, so everything's growing in horse manure. This is a painting from as late as 1921. You see cloche again. Again, you know, these people were very clever. They found ways to fight the elements, and even in the absence of hydrocarbons or natural gas, to create growing technologies that were actually fairly sophisticated. But in a way, the system was not completely local, because today a few people have rediscovered that history, and they say, well, you know, the Parisians were able to do it in the 19th century. Why can't we be as self-sufficient as they were? But of course, the trick there is that they're not self-sufficient, because they're importing a lot of horse fodder to the city. They're exporting a lot of horse food, and this is what sorts of powers the system. But long story short, technologies keep being developed in the early 20th century, so ventilating frames. They recycle sewage water, which is again another idea that is being promoted today. So Gennevilliers, this is north of Paris. Again, another look at how sophisticated local food production once was in Paris. That's what's left of it today. You have a lot of public housing buildings that eventually swallowed up that land. If you drive around Paris, you will see abandoned buildings that were once part of that local food system. But the point is that the whole thing falls apart at the turn of the 20th century. Why is that? Well, essentially because it requires a lot of work to fight the growing conditions that you have in Paris. You know, not that much sunshine in the winter, it's cold, it's gray. And then the railroad comes along and you can truck in things from Provence and Italy. And so the system falls apart remarkably quickly. And suddenly, Parisian, nobody's complaining because nobody would bother importing food over long distances if it was not cheaper, if you didn't get more value for money. So this is the part that local food activists tend to forget. So again, this is not something that I came up with on my own, but I think it summarizes the spirit of the late 19th, early 20th century. So these are Cape Cod cranberries, which are being shipped all over North America. And this is long distance brand is really what people were calling it at the time. And again, the idea being that, well, you cannot really grow cranberries in Butte, Montana. Perhaps you can grow them elsewhere along the eastern seaboard, but why would you settle for less than what the market can deliver? People in Cape Cod are very good at growing cranberries. Why don't you do something else and let us supply you? So obviously the railroad is one aspect of the 19th century transportation revolution. The other is the steamship. So this is a ship that is bringing frozen lamb from New Zealand to Europe. Again, I see a lot of proposals today of people saying, well, why don't we add sails to our boat? Well, you know, they used to do that, then they got rid of sails because they weren't worth the trouble. But again, you had a lot of lambs in New Zealand, which were at first there to produce wool. But then once refrigeration and steamships came along, well, too much meat in one place, not enough in Great Britain and other locations. Obviously, people saw a need and answered it. So what happens then with the steamship is that you can reach any location in the world at any time you want to reach it. So what you have in white here are the sail ship routes, the only places where you could go efficiently considering ocean patterns and ocean currents and wind patterns. But the blue lines here are what the steamship makes possible. So suddenly the whole world opens up and food production becomes much more globalized. A picture I took in a small museum in Montana, former gold mining town. What do you find on the shelves? Well, everything from tea from Sri Lanka to coffee from Africa to cocoa from South America. People in the 19th century really appreciate that, and obviously frozen meat and some produce. So this is, there have been economic geographers for a while, so this is an economic geography textbook from the early 20th century that describes your typical New York City breakfast, what a middle class family can afford in New York City. So the bread will have been made from wheat that was probably grown in Minnesota, the coffee comes in from Sumatra or Java, the tea from China, the sugar from Cuba, the meat from Texas prepared in St. Louis, and spices from all sorts of tropical locations. All these things are found in the great majority of households, the textbook writer tells you, and that's a good thing.
Excuse me, do they actually import sugar from Cuba in the States?
Yes, well, yeah, that was, I know for people of our generation, that's kind of hard to imagine, but actually, yes, Cuba was the biggest sugar producer in the world at the time.
Well, this was prior to...
That's like 1900, sorry, yes, this is 1903, again, sorry, I should have insisted on 1903, yes.
Thank you.
No, that's fine, no problem. So this is not a very good picture, but this is a public market in New York City. This is before supermarket comes along. The reason I selected this, I don't know if you can see them. You see bananas all over the place. Bananas are the first tropical commodities that are shipped over a long distance. Why? Well, because nature provides the package, obviously, and it takes them a long time to reap, and you can trigger their ripening in warehouses with a few technologies. So bananas are affordable, they're the cheapest food that you can give to people, and they're a very big hit, obviously, as soon as it becomes possible to bring them in from Panama and other Central American locations. So, again, to get back to that textbook writer, the dwelling of Western civilization and its various furnishing, unlike the log house of the frontiersman of a century or two ago, is a product of almost the whole world. And this is a good thing. People are ecstatic to have broken the bonds of local food in the early 20th century. So this is only one economic geography textbook, but I have a number of quotes from that time. I don't think anyone there would have thought that reverting back to local food production would have been a good thing. So I already told you a little bit about what happens to urban food production in the late 19th and early 20th century. But basically, to give it a more academic gloss, well, urban agriculture, what you saw in Paris was perhaps the most sophisticated local food system in the world, if you read people write about these things at the time. But you have local food production everywhere. But again, what happens in the late 19th, early 20th century? Well, city growth is really explosive. Jobs are mostly created in cities. I mean, economic development is typically characterized by city growth. So essentially, local food is being driven out of cities because you don't earn enough on your investment to justify growing food in cities as opposed to building factories. Then there are public health concerns. People realize that keeping chickens in their backyard is probably not a good idea. You know, Pasteur has come along, and people understand the germ theory of disease, and all those milk cows in cities living in their field, this will not only smell bad, but they tend to get sick, and you've got epidemics, and so people are happy to drive them out of city. And those Parisian producers in the high season were typically working 18 hours a day. You know, we don't think of that today. You think of a greenhouse, you might say, okay, people will push a button and, you know, you have more heat, or you turn on the lights or stuff, or the water comes with a pump or something. But in those days, you know, you had to get your water in the well, you had to shovel manure, and you spent roughly 18 hours a day during the high season. You know, then working 16 hours a day in a factory kind of looks good compared to that. So a lot of people get out of local farming and go earn more money and actually improve their working conditions by moving to factories. At the same time, agricultural areas, through both the railroad and the steamship, are increasingly linked to urban markets, and so people give up on subsistence living and begin to specialize in what their area is especially suited for. So you've got the development of new areas and new products, new production in old ones, and the abandonment of less productive land. So, excuse me if this is too simplistic, I know you're a very sophisticated audience, but again, outcome number one, better transportation plus better preservation technology. People give up on trying to produce everything themselves, subsistence farming, and specialize in what they do best. So, of course, you've got dairying, the dairy belt emerging in the northeastern state, the corn belt, which is much bigger today, spring wheat in the Dakotas, corn and winter wheat, and, you know, everything from Virginia to basically Oklahoma, cotton in the south, grazing in the west, subtropical crops in California and Florida. And suddenly it makes sense to produce peaches, oranges, and ship them to northeastern markets or other cities in the United States. This is what happens in the United States, but this happens, of course, in every advanced economy. Second outcome, well, greater freshness of produce. People don't like to store their potatoes for 8 or 9 months if they can get fresh potatoes year-round. So this is the supply of potatoes in northeastern America, in the northeastern United States a century ago. So if you live in New York, for example, the first potatoes of the new year will come from Bermuda, which is not so south in terms of latitude, but it's in the Gulf Stream. So they're actually able to produce potatoes before southern Florida, but then beginning in early March, the potatoes that are consumed in New York come from southern Florida, and then all the way up until September from the St. John River Valley between New Brunswick and Maine. And again, this happens spontaneously because people would rather eat fresh potatoes year-round than produce their potatoes on Long Island and keep them in storage for 8 or 9 months. This is potatoes, but this is true for almost everything else. So people have had a taste for fresh produce for a very long time, and as soon as technology made it possible to ship one commodity over long distances, well, Latitude did its thing, and the supply became provided from increasingly larger geographical areas. Okay, another thing that happens at the time is that food processing gets concentrated in a few locations. So this is the old Chicago stockyard. Chicago is obviously in the middle of the United States. This is the supply of beef from many regions to Chicago, which are then shipped to other parts of the United States. So I can only imagine what this smelled like. But obviously, this is the ancestor of concentrated feedlots that a lot of people don't like today. This is what the railroad gave you. Today, concentrated feedlots are supplied by trucks. But the reason why people do that is that there are such things as economies of scale in feeding animals in other places, finishing them on corn close to processing plants. And you not only have economies of scale in producing meat, but also in turning the waste into useful byproducts. So yes, the Chicago packing district was incredibly smelly and, was probably not a very pleasant place to be. But I would argue that it was much more ecologically sensible than previous system, than what people used to do before, which was to butcher their animals locally, because apart from the leather and the meat, everything else was wasted. I have these huge piles of waste in Chicago, and you obviously have an incentive to create something out of it. So this is from 1923, I believe, so leather, it's kind of obvious. Then the portions that are not edible are turned into all sorts of things, so fertilizers, what have you, things that would have been lost before, sausage casing, all sorts of other products. And for the younger people here, well, which includes pretty much everybody, before plastics came along, a lot of things were made out of animal bones. But obviously in a place like Chicago, you can use the best bones and turn them into all sorts of objects. So yes, so Chicago is not pretty, there's a history there. But in terms of efficiency, in terms of turning pollution into something useful, there were obvious advantages in concentrating processing in one location and bringing in the supply from, regions far away, as opposed to doing things locally. And so not only don't you waste anything, but because you can earn money from these things, the price of meat goes down. Competition between producers forces them to extract as much money as they can out of byproduct, and meat consumers actually benefit in the process, because then they can make money by lowering the price of meat, paradoxically. Okay, so in the last couple of decades, the last 3 or 4 decades, we've lived through another transportation revolution, which is intermodal container shipping. So it used to be that ships would spend more time in ports being loaded and unloaded than at sea. Today, large boats are not only obviously faster and more efficient, but they spend very little time in ports. And so you can move things around much more efficiently than used to be the case. And you have what are called reefers. So refrigerated containers, they're typically white to reflect sunlight. So remember those dark straw mats before to attract sunlight. How do you reflect it? You have things white. And so with intermodal container shipping at reefers, it became possible to ship fresh produce year-round. And you can get things being sent here from China and places like New Zealand, and they'll reach our supermarket in, let's say, 3 weeks from the moment they're picked to the moment they're delivered. So we also have air cargo for especially valuable things. But the point is that since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which we celebrated a few days ago, a lot of economies that were once part of the global food supply chain a century ago, like Cuba, well, Cuba obviously has not reintegrated the globalized food supply chain yet, but countries like China, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, through trade liberalization and domestic liberalizations, have begun to supply us with things cheaper. If for no other reason, that people are still willing to pick apples in China. So it's a big debate in Ontario today. I mean, why do we have so many Chinese apples in processed food and things? Well, if you know anything about apple production in Ontario, about 75% of your cost is labor, and honestly, who wants to be an apple picker these days? And is that how you build a thriving economy? But a lot of people in China are willing to do that. And so as someone who grew up in the apple industry, I don't have a problem with that. So, of course, today we get all sorts of things from India, China, Vietnam, Kenya. And, those people in Vietnam earn a lot more money than used to be the case. We might not find those jobs very desirable, but considering the real-world options that they have, I think we're actually helping them by buying stuff from them. So, that's my sort of 15-minute version of the history of the globalized food supply chain. What a lot of local food activists don't realize either is that there were many reactions against this. The local food movement is not something recent, it's something that is as old as the trends that I've just described. So this is an image that I like so much that I have it on the door of my office. It's a World War II poster from Great Britain. I don't know if you can see that if you're watching through the camera, but use spades, not ships. So what happens in the United Kingdom in the 19th century? Well, obviously it becomes the factory of the world. British producers can no longer compete with people in New Zealand, Canada, and other places. So the British import more food than anybody else. That's kind of a problem when you have U-boats roaming the North Atlantic. And so, of course, during the First and Second World War, there are pushbacks, or at least there are British authorities encourage people to produce local food, and so they produce a number of very clever posters, grow your own food and supply your own cookhouse, because, again, you've got U-boats roaming the North Atlantic. But this is only one part of, or at least one story among many others in the past local food movement. So just to look at the United States, I'll give you a quick overview of various movements that go back to the early 19th century. So how many of you are familiar with the New England Transcendentalists? Not too many, okay. Well, basically they're kind of the hippies of their days. So that's kind of the early 19th century. So George Ripley is a well-known transcendentalist. Long story short, Massachusetts begins to industrialize. A lot of people are unhappy with that. They want to move back to the land and create little farms where they will consume local products among themselves. And in that case, they will earn money by having a school and teaching people. But this fellow here, Bronson Alcott, is even more radical. So you might not know him, but you might know his daughter, Louisa May Alcott. Yeah, Dr. Marshall, yeah, Little Women. Yeah. So he thinks that Ripley doesn't go far enough. So he buys a farm, which is called Fruitlands, and he tries to create a community that I think will be more conducive to his personal flourishing and the people who will live with him. So they have a few rules. First of all, they have to be self-sufficient. So mostly fruits and water. No stimulants or animal products. And this, in his opinion, will eliminate the treat for trade and minimize labor. But in essence, what that really means in the early 19th century is that you won't consume coffee, tea, molasses, or rice, which are now available in Massachusetts. No meat, butter, cheese, elk, or milk. They're actually ethical vegetarians. They don't want to hurt animals. But also no wool, manure, wax, and animal labor. This is especially problematic because they don't have tractors in those days. And Ripley and Alcott obviously does not know a lot about farming, but the people there realize quickly that, well, without a big oxen or a big horse to pull your plow, you don't actually get a lot of work done. He's also against vegetables growing downwards, so they're not allowed to eat carrots, beets, and potatoes. I'm not quite sure why, but the argument is that these showed a lower nature. So if it grew downwards, it was kind of bad for you. There might have been some meaning there. I'm still trying to understand that one. They're also opposed to cotton, and this I can see again because the argument here is that cotton is produced by slaves at the time, and so you don't do that. So, long story short, as you can suspect, Fruitlands is created in May when everything is fine, people don't do much, then September comes and they realize, well, we haven't really done anything, we're going to starve if we stay here, so they go away. But Ripley's, the other experiment that I described to you, lasted 3 or 4 years. Okay, so these are the first hippie communes in a way. So fast forward almost a century, you've got the First World War, then the Second World War. The logic is the same again. Europeans are busy killing themselves and destroying their economies and their agriculture, so let's try to save food in North America and ship as much as we can to the troops and starving allies, so grow more of your own food so that we can ship more cereal grain to Europe. So this is the United States Department of Agriculture, 1917 wartime poster, which I think would not be out of place in many farmers' markets today. So I don't know if you can read that in the back, but help feed yourself, make backyards and vacant lots productive, work a garden, raise chickens, grow vegetables and fruit in your backyard. Somebody has to raise or pack everything you eat, do your share, learn to preserve your food yourself and what have you. And people actually do that. I mean, the United States obviously enters the First World War a little bit late, but the movement is successful, and you can read accounts written in 1917 saying that they're relearning the skill of their grandmothers. That just tells you how long people had been moving out of the countryside into cities and how they had become dependent on other people supplying them. So this is Washington, D.C., a few blocks from the White House that converted vacant lots into a lot where you could grow food. But there were also other movements. In the early 20th century in the United States, you've got people who obviously don't produce a lot of food themselves, but who think that immigrants' children are too removed from the countryside. They don't understand where the food comes from. So in places like San Francisco, New York, and other large cities, they sponsor school gardens in order to teach immigrant kids especially the arts of growing their food. I mean, this will be something valuable. We'll get them closer to nature. They'll be less likely to get into trouble. And so there are books published among school gardens. This one is 1910, I believe. Children's Garden for School and Home, 1904. And this is again a history that local food activists don't really know about, but I could show you very similar manuals being produced these days, or maybe websites to essentially promote the same idea. And then there's basic economic survival during recessions and economic depression. So the movement is originally associated with Pink Reeves, the mayor of Detroit. So today Detroit is at the vanguard of converting empty lots into gardens. But there's actually a long history of doing that there. So in the 1880s, the mayor of New York urges, almost coerces owners of vacant lots to convert them into gardens, or at least let poor people grow their potatoes. So potato patches. Here you can see fresh vegetables from the vacant lot gardens. This is from the late 19th century. There are also a number of people who urge a movement back to the land. Again, a lot of people think that the back to the land movement goes back to the hippies of the 1960s. Actually, it doesn't. It's a big movement in the early 20th century in the United States. A number of people believe that the Industrial Revolution has run its course. I mean, what kind of new jobs can be created in cities? They cannot view that. So there are people like this fellow here, Bolton Hall, who writes a tract called A Little Land and a Living. And he says, yeah, we should depopulate cities, move people back to the countryside where they could be self-sufficient, and at least they could live that way as opposed to being unemployed in cities. Again, fast forward a few decades, Depression Relief Gardens. So this is Youngstown, Ohio. You can see the steel mills in the back here and people growing garden right next to them. So again, when you have no jobs, people spontaneously revert to growing their own food. I mean, you go to Greece today, a lot of people are doing that because there are basically no other jobs available. Eleanor Roosevelt would sponsor subsistent homesteads in West Virginia. In that case, the idea is to get unemployed miners to move back to the countryside and create self-sufficient communities. The most well-known is called Harterdale. But local food as an economic development strategy is a very old story too. In short, what happens in the United States during the First World War is that farmers expand their production and they count on Europeans to buy their surplus. At the end of the First World War, Europe begins to produce food again, so there's this huge surplus in the United States. A lot of farmers are going bankrupt. So a number of people promote local food and developing local markets and supplying local people as a way to create jobs. So a number of agricultural economists in the 1920s earned their living studying those local food movements. So the first one is really in Altoona, Pennsylvania. This is a bulletin published in the early 1920s, adjusting production to meet on market demands in Blair County, Pennsylvania. So basically, economists go around and try to find people who could grow stuff where they could supply the market and create jobs and local economic activity there and keep money in the community. There's also a long tradition of thinking that everything that stands between a farmer and a final consumer is essentially a parasite. And so this idea of cutting intermediary is also very old. So an important progressive here, a man from Philadelphia, Cook in 1918, deplores the trade in strawberries at the time. So if you followed controversies about local food in Ontario today, it's often about strawberries. And today the big problem is that most strawberries in North America are produced in California, trucked in Ontario, and our local producers suffer. Well, a century ago, most strawberries in the United States were produced in Delaware and in neighboring states, and they were supplying most of the East Coast. But obviously they had to be trucked over some distance, or at least moved along railroads. So people like Cook will say, well, strawberries are produced in Delaware, they're shipped to Philadelphia 104 miles to be sold to a wholesaler, will return them to Wilmington, Delaware to a storage house and a commission man, which will sell them again, will by Oxford steam 14 miles to Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. So, all these intermediaries, all this transportation is very wasteful. Why don't we try to connect producers with final consumers? And he says, well, inequality left in the berries after the last leg of this roundabout journey is due rather to the providence of God than to the wisdom of man. So transportation waste value, intermediaries only result in higher prices for consumers. So we need to do something about that. Okay, quickly, the same movements can be observed outside of the United States. I just want to give you a few examples here. Social reformer in the early 20th century, if you know anything about the history of city planning, Ebenezer Howard, Garden Cities of Tomorrow. These are planned communities. Again, cities are full of horse manure. They're really viewed as unpalatable by a lot of people. So you create cities that become more self-sufficient, and you have room in them for both large farms, but also community allotments. That's part of the original plan. So again, this is nothing new. These things were incorporated in that. Garden Depression in Scotland. World War II in the United Kingdom, their campaign is known as Dig for Victory. So grow your own vegetables, dig for victory, kids working, and school kids spending their recreation, their spare times growing food. And again, this is not a modern day locavore, this is simply a good British citizen in the Second World War, keeping a goat, ducks, rabbits, chickens, giant zucchini, I guess, I don't know, bees, corn, cabbage. This is what people were doing there because they had no choice. Okay, so again, intermediaries, this is a quote from a British MP, but I have a number of those, just take my word on that. When farmers from distant from town try to dispose of their fruit and vegetables, they find themselves struggling so hopelessly in the spider webs of ring and middlemen and speculators that they are more than half inclined to give up the attempt in despair. So again, let's try to connect farmers to final consumers. That's my favorite local food movement ever. It's called the Empire Marketing Board. And in that case, local market is defined as the British Empire. So that's, local is a notion that is very subjective. They have very cute posters, but I've not shown them to you. But these posters are good because they show you when the first oranges were shipped from South Africa to the United Kingdom, the first BC salmon, the first grapes from Australia, butter from New Zealand. But in that case, local food is the British Empire. Keep your money in the local empire. And despite that, it will fail. It will only last a few years. And British consumers didn't care about their brethren in the British Empire. If something was produced more cheaply in, God forbid, a French colony, they'll actually buy that stuff instead. Another aspect that is conveniently forgotten by local food activists today is that it's often one of the first policies that is implemented by dictators. So I don't know if you recognize Benito Mussolini here, kind of typical, duce. But he's standing on a tractor. I don't know if you can see that. And that's because one of the first policies that he implements once he secures his power base in the early 1920s is what he calls the Battaglia del Grano, so the battle for grain. Now, Italy is very good at producing, olives, citrus fruits, grapes, things like that. But it's really not all that great at producing wheat, which is why even in Roman days they used to import their wheat mostly from other locations. But Mussolini views that as a form of slavery, and that's the word he uses. Italy is the slave of Hungary, France, the United States, Canada, other places. So he pushes very hard to promote, to boost grain production in Italy. So, and I don't know if he worked more than that day, but this is Mussolini again. So it kind of reminds me of Vladimir Putin in a way. He used to show his torso and stuff. So hardworking. So, per l'autarchia alimentare del nostro paese, I apologize for my Italian, but essentially for the autarchic feeding of our country, and so again, this is the fascist, the fasce, the symbol of the fascists, and Mussolini will win. He will win his battle for grain. The problem is that you don't grow grain in alpine pastures, so they raise down a lot of vineyards, a lot of orchards, and things like that. And so in the end, the Italians pay a lot more for their food, and they have much less diversity available. But he will achieve quasi self-sufficiency. But the question is, so what is local, and why don't these movements ever last? And then I finally get to what I call the 5 myths of locavorism. So again, I won't get into the details now, but this is another thing that I got from my local paper in Guelph. More natural processes, local food are usually ingredients or core food items that are not filled with preservatives and additives. But first, I need to state the obvious. As far as I know, you might contradict this on me, but we still don't import food from outer space, right? It's still produced on our planet. We can agree on that. And so obviously, there are a lot of us. There are over 7 billion of us on the planet. So wherever the food is produced, chances are that it will be close to some other human beings, right? And when it is the best value for money that you get, well, people will obviously buy local food. They won't pay more for something that is shipped from further away, and that again gives them less value for money. So the implication, I think, is that good quality, affordable food needs to be grown somewhere on Earth, and you will have consumers for it. So I'm obviously not against local food when it is sensible. But the thing then is that you don't need a marketing campaign. Consumers will buy it anyway. if you want to have a local food movement, if you want to go beyond that, then obviously local will have to trump something like affordability, nutrition, safety, or taste. Because again, if the local alternative is the best, people will buy it for no other reason than it is the best thing available. So in other words, locavores eat local, but the implication is that they must expand local food production and reduce food imports. Otherwise, there's no point having a local food movement. So the way they justify what seems counterintuitive is that it has a number of benefits that are not captured by, let's say, market value. So the first is that it creates social capital. We don't know who produces our food, and somehow I'm not as spiritually fulfilled because of that. If I knew what produced the Tim Hortons sandwich you were eating before, perhaps you would have led a better, you would be smiling more tonight, I don't know. So there are such things as community-supported agriculture where you get to know the people who produce your food. And this in theory makes you happier. So you cut the intermediary, again, all those parasites that I've talked about before, and you go beyond the barcode and the brand bullies. These are common expressions of people who promote CSA. So marketing claims, well, always grass-fed, free-range, fresh, and delicious. Why wouldn't they be, right? The problem, again, is that you go back in the past when most food was local, and then the fact that you knew your producer or that you knew the person who fed you really guaranteed the quality of what you were eating. And the short answer is no. So this is a book published by a German chemist who moves to London in the early 19th century. So what is happening then? Well, in the base case scenario, for example, people will add rice powder to cream, water to your beer, chicory to your coffee, and sometimes it will be other stuff that will make you really sick. And Hackham says that food adulteration is carried on to a most alarming extent in every part of the United Kingdom. And he makes a decent living trying to catch people who cheat. So, local food for local people, and yet someone like that can actually make a living and write a best-selling book. What does that tell you? Well, what about today? When you go to a farmer's market, can you really trust the people who have signed those little forms swearing that they give you local food harvested by... Well, if you Google that, if you don't trust me, just Google farmer's market and fraud, and you will realize that when journalists follow those local producers, they often end up in fields that grow only wheat, and the only thing that is really local about the food that is sold there is that it was bought at the local Costco. But what's the difference between Costco and somebody who lies to your face in a farmer's market? Well, if Costco lies to you, it's a big juicy target for lawyers. If a fly-by-night operator at a farmer's market lies to you, the first rule of fundraising, right? You don't ask money from a beggar. You don't sue a fly-by-night operator at a farmer's market. It's not worth it. So what happens historically is that brands and large corporations emerge for a reason. One of the first brands to appear in the United States is Quaker Oats. And what's their main appeal? Well, in a way, they kind of lie. Quaker Oats was not founded by Quakers. If you believe that, you're wrong. But why do they use Quakers as a symbol? Because Quakers have the reputation of being trustworthy. But even if the founders of Quaker Oats kind of lie about this, when you buy a box of Quaker Oats cereals in Buffalo, New York, or Los Angeles, or Chicago, you know exactly what you will get, and the quality is there. Which is why brand emerged. It's a way to build trust with people you don't know. And there's a reason why brands emerge and become so dominant, and why little fly-by-night operators tend to disappear. Because, again, without brands, you're back to the world of Acom. With brands, yes, okay, people eat the same stuff in Buffalo, New York, and Los Angeles, but they know exactly what they're getting. And Quaker Oats is big enough to be sued. So their brand and their reputation is all that they have. So other problems that have become obvious with community-supported agriculture, well, it turns out that even if you get rid of the intermediaries, you don't see a reduction in price. Typically, things tend to become more expensive. Why is that? Well, believe it or not, intermediaries actually add value. They can find the best producers, they give you the best price, they can aggregate stuff, there are economies of scale in processing things, and so they exist because they actually add value. They specialize in what they do, and they do best. They do it best. Farmers, commercial ones anyway, not the ones that tend to sell at farmers market, specialize in what they do best, and they're happy to let other people handle the marketing because that's another set of skills and it's complicated. Community-supported agriculture, typically in convenient pickup locations or times. Either you go to the farm or you meet the farmer at a time that is convenient to the farmer. But you also have no flexibility, and so a lot more food is actually wasted when, for example, you decide for the last minute to send the kids 2 weeks away to visit their grandparents. You've bought everything in advance. That's the key to CSA. So you're left with a bunch of food. Either you give it away or typically it ends up in the compost pile. So it turns out that having supermarkets that give you the exact amount of food that you need when you need them, in a convenient location with long business hours, a parking lot, is actually something worth paying for, and you waste less money that way. So the result is that when you try to support these things, you have less money and less time to, coach Little League Soccer, to give to your local, to give to your local church. Okay, this might not be the best audience for that, but to give to other activities that can actually create social capital. Okay, what about the myth that you keep the money locally? Well, so if you buy from your local farmer, will he buy his diesel locally? Will he buy his tractor locally? Will he buy his truck locally? Well, obviously not. But beyond that, again, you've got to remember that people began importing food from distant locations because they gave you more value for money in the first place. Otherwise, there was no point in developing the globalized food supply chain. So by definition, and there are often the common mistake that is often made here is that, when we reach harvest season in Ontario, some journalists will go to the farmer's market and will say, well, it's not that much more expensive. Well, yeah, that's because farmers in one area tend to produce the same thing. They all get together at the farmer's market at the same time. There's some competition there. They cannot charge all that much more than supermarkets. But without getting into the methodological problems of looking at things that way, again, just intuitively, you understand that nobody would be importing food from further away if you had better local alternatives. So that means that you have less resources available to buy other things, and you destroy more jobs in the process. You also cannot generate urbanization and economies of scale and transformation. So remember what I told you about the Chicago stockyards, but the same is true for all food processing today. There are such things as economies of scale in food processing, and gathering stuff from several areas, concentrating them in one location does deliver significant economies. Then what about people working hard in less developed countries? I mean, local food is all about helping poor people and keeping farmers in business. Yeah, well, what about them? They're the ones who actually benefit the most from exporting, and you want to cut down access to your market. How is that fair or ethical or what have you? Okay, what about the myth of environmental sustainability? How many of you have heard the expression food miles? Yeah, so the idea is that 95% of our transportation system is powered by fossil fuels. You cannot burn fossil fuels without emitting greenhouse gases. So obviously, the less food travels, the less greenhouse gas you'll emit, right? Not really. In order for that to be true, you would have to. This is an image that, again, I found online, and you help me, I'm a geographer. I'm still looking for that place. But if you ever find a location where a palm tree grows right next to an apple tree, please let me know. I'm still looking for it. I haven't found it. But you see this thing is trucked, shipped, put on an airplane, delivered, versus the apple that literally falls from the tree into the plate of the consumer here. So in order for this to be true, though, this tree and this tree must be absolutely identical, and the only difference between the two is that in one case you've got this, in the other you've got nothing. You don't even have anyone picking the apple. Which I can tell you, having grown with parents right in orchard, this doesn't happen. You actually still need to pick your apples. I know. So in other words, food miles are only valid when everything else is equal. But, one way I can justify being paid by taxpayers to teach geography is that I need to remind kids and students that no, not everything else is equal, and understanding geography is actually something useful. So first of all, some locations that don't look so different might have very different capacities to deliver some good to the market. So even the United Kingdom and New Zealand, which are little islands in the ocean and very green, both get a lot of rain, you might think, well, they must be relatively similar in terms of food efficiency, right? Well, no, not really. Using the same amount of resources, the New Kiwis, New Zealanders produce 3 times more apple, 4 times more lamb, and 2 times more milk solid. Among other things, that's because their pastoral land in New Zealand is much better, a lot more clover and whatever. They don't need to give as much supplemental animal feed as British producers do. But the point is that even locations that look similar might have very different productivity levels in producing some commodities. Then the mode of transportation has a huge impact. So a container ship today floats on water. It has huge diesel engines and burns bunker fuel. So the carbon signature, or the amount of fuel that is burned to bring an apple from New Zealand to North America, is the equivalent roughly of 1 cent of diesel. It's really nothing. You know, that thing floats on water, it's nothing. By contrast, putting a few apples in the back of your pickup truck, delivering it to market, might have just as big a diesel footprint, perhaps even bigger. And then something again that people need to be reminded of: latitude. So again, remember the potato example I gave you, Bermuda, then the first, then the potatoes come from South Florida all the way up to Maine at different times of the year. Well, what's the main contrast between the northern and the southern hemisphere? Well, their summer is our winter and vice versa. So New Zealand, our apples are basically picked in September and October. New Zealand, March, April. So what happens when you want to eat a fresh apple, let's say in the month of May in Ontario? Well, you have two options. Either you get an Ontario apple that was put in cold storage for several months, or you get an apple that was picked in New Zealand something like 3 weeks before. And obviously there's a huge energy footprint associated with putting an Ontario apple in storage. So at certain times of the year, it makes sense to import apples from New Zealand. But then the system works both ways, and this is something that people don't remember. New Zealanders are often known as kiwis because they produce a lot of kiwis, but at certain times of the year in New Zealand, the kiwis that you will eat will have been produced in Italy. And why is that? Well, because Italy is the biggest kiwi producer in Europe. And again, seasons are inverted. So it makes more sense economically and environmentally to eat New Zealand kiwis in Italy at certain times of the year and Italian kiwis in New Zealand at other times of the year, because again, you don't need to keep them in cold storage for a long period of time. So freshness, lower prices, there's a reason why our system evolved the way it did. So in that context, transportation is really insignificant. So that people tend to forget that, you need a lot of inputs, storage, processing, whatever, in getting food to our market. And in that context, in the United States, that's a rough estimate, but roughly long-distance transportation represents 4% of the environmental footprint, greenhouse gas equivalent, of food production. And so what happens if you want to reduce transportation? Well, typically you might need a heated greenhouse, whereas in another location nature might have provided the heat free of charge, or you might need more irrigation water compared to another place where there's more rain or what have you. So reducing transportation typically means that you need to increase the level of inputs of your local location, because again, people would not have imported things from further away in the first place if producing over in another location was not more efficient than locally. So yes, you reduce transportation, but overall the effect will be negative because local production is not as good as the other location in the first place. So what happens when, thanks to transportation, you produce food in the best locations the world over? So this is a map of the evolution of the forest cover of the United States over the last 4 centuries. So the dark areas here is basically the forest cover of the United States in the 1620s. We now know that most natives died of diseases. 95% of the natives are gone. The forest grows back. Before Columbus showed up, there would actually have been less forest. But anyway, this is what European settlers find in 1620. So at first they stick to coastlines and rivers. This is what the forest cover of the United States looks like in the 1860s. Then the railroad comes along. You can see what's left. And look at the forest cover in the United States today. What has happened? Well, essentially two things. So food, everything is better except in, I don't know if you see North Dakota here. You kind of see 3 trees here, and they've kind of disappeared. So I guess some of you might have heard the old joke, what is the state tree of North Dakota? The telephone pole? Do you know what a telephone pole is? You hear people, yeah, maybe not. But anyway, what happens here? Well, food production obviously moves in the best location, and we produce today a lot more food on a lot less land than used to be the case. So, if you are a farmer in Appalachia, you realize, there's no point. You can only grow so much on a hillside that is very rocky. So people move out, and nature, forests grow back. But again, this would be impossible if we were to revert back to local food production, because by definition, local food production would be less productive. So as long as any rural economy is self-sufficient, it has to produce everything which it needs, irrespective of whether the soil is suitable or not. Grain has to be cultivated on infertile, stony, and steeply sloping ground, as well as on rich soils. And that's again because without modern transportation, in that case the railroad, you cannot move large quantities of food over long distances. So food security. Another argument used by local food activists is that, well, monocultures, remember those Irish potato farmers, that's one form of locavorism. What happens when you've got a fungus problem? Well, a lot of Irish dies and move to North America. I actually have some Irish blood in me because in Quebec, again, for French Canadian, it was okay to marry a Catholic even if you didn't speak your language. So, like many Quebecois, I have some Irish root that can be traced back to the Irish potato famine, as opposed to a local food system, which by definition will have to be more diverse. The Irish were an aberration. Subsistence farmer who practiced monoculture. Nobody else did that in history because obviously you know that something might go wrong with one of your crops. So subsistence farmers the world over have always tried to hedge their bets, if you will, by producing different things. And if we were to subsist again, to revert back to local food production, well, obviously we would need to grow more things than we do at the moment, as opposed to specializing in a few crops, if you remember that Corn Belt, Dairy Belt map of the United States. So a lot of people don't think any further than this. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. What happens if our monoculture fail? Yeah, but what local food activists tend to forget is that you're basically told to put all your agricultural eggs in one regional basket. How is that better? So yeah, okay, you might have a diversity of crops, but look at what happened historically. So this is rinderpest. We never had it in North America, but you see here a bunch of grass-fed, free-range, and antibiotic-free cows in South Africa. A lot of good it didn't have much. Rinderpest affected goats. It affected a number of animals. So you have some diseases that will really cut a broad swath across the types of production. Insects are not very discriminating. They'll eat a lot of stuff. Floods. Water does not discriminate a lot either. It doesn't matter how diversified you are. Flood will do a lot of damage. Frost, droughts. And so the basic fact of the evolution of our food system, Cormac O'Grady, one of the world's foremost economic historian of famine, the historical records suggest that the integration of markets and the gradual eradication of famines are linked. Why is that? Well, as everybody understands in the 19th century, because people still remember the bad old days, this is from one lady who wrote this in 1824. Now, it is very improbable either that a state of warfare with various countries at the same period of time will occur, that they should all be afflicted with the dearth of produce in the same season. There is much greater chance of a scarcity prevailing in any single country than in every part of the world at once. So, everybody in the early 19th century, all the way up to, I would say, the early 20th, understands that, the way to avoid the kind of famines that would occur historically, because things will go wrong, wherever you are, is to globalize the food system as much as possible. And the problem historically, you had famine because things would go wrong. And one harvest, people could survive by eating things that are trendy today, like, I don't know, beech leaves or roots or whatever. 2 bad harvests in a row, and you had famine. You had famine and starvation. Okay, myth number 5, nutrition and safety. Fresher by mile, making fresh simple. The standard argument, well, fresher delivers not only better taste, but also better nutrition. And here the key argument is that produce loses its taste or nutritional quality the longer it travels. So there are 2 lines of argument that you can use here to challenge that. First of all, to say that the distance doesn't matter, it's the preservation and transportation technology that matters. So frozen vegetables, for example, are just as nutritious if they're prepared properly, you don't lose anything. But then, the only argument that I made in the book, because it's so obvious, is that local food cannot win, because in any part of the world, whether you've got a tropical climate or a temperate climate like ours, local food will only be in season a few weeks each year for each type of food that you grow locally. So if fresher is the key, local food cannot win, because you'll only have fresh stuff a few weeks each year, but you go to our supermarkets today and you get fresh stuff from other latitudes. And so if the argument is local is fresher, well, if fresher is better, then local cannot win. I don't know why I needed to point that out, but you should see the sort of number of people going, oh my God, well, yeah. So going local will not only mean also lower productivity and less variety. So to get back to wartime Europe, what happens in Europe when they revert back to local? Well, typically they've got to switch the type of food that they produce to feed their population. So typically grassland are converted to cropland, but the reason why they had been converted in grassland in the first place is that they're not all that productive. People give up on meat. I don't know where you stand on that, but give up on meat and eat more potatoes and cereal. You get rid of beef cattle, replace it by dairy cattle. But you also eliminate and reduce things that eat the same animal feed as humans. So typically, the lower quality grain is given to chicken and hogs. In wartime, humans eat the lower quality stuff. You cannot afford to give it to chicken and hogs. If you like your dogs or your horse, it's too bad. They're gone. People will eat them. Brewing, distilling, and luxury products, pastries are out the window, and white bread disappears and is replaced by, whatever type of whole wheat grain you have, plus whatever else you can throw in it. And this is why, of course, as soon as wars are over, people don't like their diet. And, we're omnivores. Most people like their meat. So this is why these wartime strategies never last. There's a high cost, lower quality food. There's a reason why, again, the globalized food supply chain was developed in the first place. Okay, safety. A lot of people obsess about synthetic pesticides today, but people who died of food poisoning don't die of eating pesticides. They die of things like or they're sick by, Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter. And again, there are economies of scale in dealing with those things. Shipping a lot of produce from a lot of producers to one central location facilitates control procedures. And so our food supply is actually a lot safer than it used to be. The argument of local food activists is, well, if you've got a batch of salad with E. coli, it will contaminate the whole stock. Well, no, food safety specialists are not stupid. They have procedures. And our food supply today the numbers are approximative, but is about 100 times safer than it was a century ago. So for one person that gets sick today from eating food, you had about 100 person getting sick a century ago. I'm almost done. The deadliest outbreak in the United States these last few years, I don't know if you remember that, 25 deaths from listeriosis, from pesticide-free, organic, free-range farms. So cantaloupes are really bad for that. And that's what happened. Okay, what about this argument here? That's the new food pyramid. I don't know if you can see that. Chinese producers have a tendency to put all sorts of funny stuff in their cat food and human food. What you need to remember here is that you don't buy directly from the Chinese farmer, which might be a good thing, but from your supermarket. And believe it or not, poisoning your customer is not really a good business plan. So they make sure that the food they buy has been tested and controlled. And so if you buy a Chinese apple in your supermarket, knowledgeable people have gone through the stock, and they can assure you that you won't get sick. Okay, almost done. So conclusion, what are locavores really up against today? So the standard mindset of those people is occupy the food supply and the corporate exploitation of our food system. Monsanto, Monster Cento, large corporations, what have you. But that's really not what they're up against. Again, I justify my existence as an economic geographer by reminding them that, bad local weather can kill you. A drought, 2 bad harvests in a row, you're up against that. Then some places are just better than other at producing stuff. If nature gives you heat free of charge, why would you have a heated greenhouse? There are such things as economies of scale in both producing and processing the food, and it's impossible to get a thriving economy without moving people out of the countryside and into cities. And cities cannot be supplied by local food. There's a quote I often use, I did not use it today, but if you remember The Republic, if you've ever read it, at one point all the philosophers are gathered together, and there's Socrates talking to the young pops, and the philosophers are discussing the following issue: where should we locate our ideal city? And so one of the young pops asks Socrates, well, Socrates, what about in a place where we don't need to import anything? And Socrates says, young man, there is no such place in the world. So already in Athens, over 1,000 years ago, Athens could not survive without importing grain from what is now the Ukraine and other parts of Greece. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Napoleon Bonaparte, a sustainable development practitioner of the early 19th century, who liked the English so much that he decided to encourage them to produce everything themselves by installing something called the Continental Blockade. Napoleon was not exactly stupid. After all, we still remember him today. He's trying to blockade the United Kingdom, obviously to kill them economically and to get them to surrender to French rule. Why is he doing that if promoting local food for local people is the way to promote economic development? How stupid is Napoleon? Okay, what about the Union blockade? Why didn't Abraham Lincoln blockade the southern states in the U.S.? Was he again promoting local economic development, local food for local people? Why were there such things as blockade runners who were worshipped in the southern states, bringing food or bringing stuff from other locations? Winston Churchill, how dumb was he when he decided to blockade the German in the First World War? Doesn't he know that the Germans could increase local food production? Well, no, actually the Germans starved. And that's part of the problem that created the Nazis' local food policy in the Second World War, but that's another issue that I did not. The reason why the Germans want to invade Eastern Europe and produce their food there is it's because a lot of them starved to death in the First World War. That's something that is kind of forgotten. Okay, so this is the place where I throw some eye candy to the women in the audience. How many of you have seen 300? Okay, so you might know that there are a few oddities in that movie. So the body armor is all wrong, obviously. King Leonidas of Sparta has a Scottish accent. This is a type of wheat, semi-dwarf wheat, that was created a few decades ago that did not exist. There's no way the Spartans or their slaves would have had that type of yield. But the biggest anachronism in there are the Spartans themselves. So Gerald Butler in real life is 6'3". It's about that tall. And if you've seen the movie, he's about the same height and the same build as all the other Spartans there. We know from graves and armors that the average Spartan hoplite was 5'4". Local food, global food. Just saying, it's not genetics, it's just that modern day actors are better nourished than Spartan hoplites. Okay, the joys of producing local food in Finland, late 19th century. This is actually the last famine in Finland. This was captured by a painter, so I don't know if you see the belly of that little girl here. This is an image that we used to associate with African kids when I was growing up. So growing food in Finland is like growing food in the Appalachia. I mean, you burn down the landscape, you get maybe 2 harvests, then you have to move on. Not much fun. There's a lot of reason why half of the Finns now live in North America. This is what local food really looked like for British peasants. So Vincent van Gogh, I won't even try to say that in Dutch, but that's a painting that's called The Potato Eaters. And what he's trying to do here is that he's sort of tired of the romanticism that many painters have imbued their pastoral paintings with. And he says, well, this is what real life looks like for European peasants. So potatoes, cheese, bad coffee, and I hope you enjoy your dinner. That's pretty much all they have. And we know that until the mid-1800s, until the transportation revolution is really in full swing, most Europeans remain in a chronic state of undernourishment. I'm quoting from real experts here. Outside of the harvest period, the standard fare of an 18th century German laborer was gruel and mush, so a soupy combination of grain and lentils. And in the early 1800s, the English farm worker, the best fed farm worker in the world, will subsist on bread, a little cheese, bacon, fat, weak tea, and beer, and on good days, modest amount of beef and mutton. At harvest time, you might have a few vegetables, but that's it. I mean, that's what you live on. And you're the best fed farm worker in the world. So ideas have consequences. Locavorism, I argue, can only deliver higher costs and greater poverty, no environmental and social benefits, less food security, poorer nutrition, and a significant penalty to developing economies. Thomas Sutcliffe Mort, I believe his statue is in Sydney in New South Wales, Australia today. Mort is the first Australian businessman that tries to create a big meat packing plant to ship frozen meat to the United States and the United Kingdom. He fails, goes bankrupt, and dies not long after that. But when he inaugurates his packing plant, he has a speech that I think is worth remembering. So the time has arrived when the various portions of the earth will each give forth their products for the use of each and of all, that the overabundance of one country will make up for the deficiency of another, the superabundance of the year of plenty serving for the scant harvest of its successor, climate, season, plenty, scarcity, distance will all shake hands, and out of the coming lane will come enough and for all. Then he says something that you might not like. He says, well, God has provided enough food for everybody, but the problem is that where the food is, the people are not, and where the people are, the food is not. But it is within the power of man to do something about this. And a lot of people understood that at the time. I told you about the Back to the Land movement. Typical rebuttal to that. Back to the land is an idle dream. We cannot restore the pastoral age more than we can go back to the spindle and the loom. And that's pretty much all I have to tell you.
Think Again TV is produced by Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.